So we talk a lot in this course about ESG risk factors. And again, the idea that ESG is not some box-ticking exercise where, if you just tick off some things, then you're good to go. Again, it's like these broader principles to create sustainable businesses that are not just sustainable from an internal profitability standpoint, but also sustainable, from a global societal perspective. If you were to kind of hit on, and you just talked about one of them, but if you were to hit on some of the risk factors, again, I'm now the CEO of a company that said, hey, Matt, give me an elevator pitch to help me understand why I should care about this and what risks are maybe around the corner if I don't. What would be some of the main things that you would say?
Well, let me talk about kind of the vulnerability aspects, and then I'll address the risk. So let's use a scenario. You have a Nepalese villager. He's making $30 a month. He's never going to make more than that in the village. He is able to survive but not thrive. All of a sudden, a recruitment agent comes in and says, how would you like to make $250 a month? Guy says, that's great. What do I need to do? Well, you need to go with me to Kathmandu, sign some papers. We'll get you a passport. We'll train you. We'll put you on a plane, send you to Malaysia. You'll make all kinds of money. Oh, wait, by the way, you have to give us $1,500. This guy says, I don't have $1,500. Well, will you have this organization we work with? They'll lend it to you. Don't worry, we'll pay it back really quickly. So he borrows the money, not realizing that there's all kinds of fees and penalties and interest rates that he doesn't understand. By the time he gets to Kathmandu, it's not $1,500, it's $3,000. By the time he gets to Malaysia, it's $4,500. So this poor guy ends up getting to Malaysia and owing $4,500. He's not sending anything home because he has to pay that back. That could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years, depending upon the rate at which it's coming. And so he's actually worse off than he was before because nothing is going home. The reason why it's an indicator of modern slavery is because it's debt bondage. He can't leave that job until he pays it back. So he's in Malaysia. When he gets to Malaysia, they also ask him to sign a contract. And he signed a contract in Nepal. Maybe he couldn't read, somebody read it to him, but at least he knew what it said. Yeah. When he gets to Malaysia, they give him another one. He looks at it and says, I don't know what it says. Sign it. Looks at it and says, I can't sign it. I don't know what it says. Sign it or we're going to send you back and lose everything. It's just pro bono. I mean, it's pro forma type of thing. You don't have to worry about it. And so basically he signs this thing, not realizing that it has additional fees and penalties and targets. And so he's not really making $250. He's making $125. And again, that's being used to pay his debt back. Yeah. Another thing is when he gets there, they take his passport. They say they need it for a visa. Yeah. And so basically he doesn't think much of it, but 2 years after he says, I want to go home. They say, no, give me my passport. No. What do you mean, no? Give me my passport. I'm going to go to the police. Who do you think they're going to believe? Us, we live here, or you? They're going to realize you don't have your documentation. They're going to put you in a remand center, send you home. You're going to lose everything. So these are just a couple of indicators. The ILO has 11 indicators of modern slavery, human trafficking, and they address various elements of procedural things that have to be in place. When auditors go into a factory, this is what they're looking for. And if these things are...
Just to clarify, social auditors or like not financial auditors?
Just auditors in general are supposed to be looking at this. Yeah. Now with the changes that we see taking place with more emphasis on ESG, on transparency legislation and so forth, they're going deeper into the social audit side of it. So what would have been maybe 3 questions or 4 questions on the audit related to an entire half day or full day of things is now maybe 10 or 12. And they're actually trying to go onto the floor to actually talk to workers. And if they're really doing their job, they'll look for migrants because the migrants are the ones that are most disenfranchised. But imagine this, okay, so if an investigative journalist goes to a factory and finds out that the workers don't have their passports, they can legitimately say this is an indicator of modern slavery. Now, this is where it gets kind of strange, where maybe the reason why they don't have their passports is because they don't have lockers and they gave it to the manager to hold on to it. It doesn't matter. But the vulnerability of that association with that particular, I don't have my documentation, can result in a situation where companies are called out. Now, you don't want to wear a top or a pair of shoes or a belt that is tainted by modern slavery. If social media is portraying a particular product as being associated with that, it's a real problem for the brand that's trying to promote their materials.
Okay, so let's, for a moment, let's use the exact example that you did in a specific context, just for our viewers out there. So let me kind of set the scene for a minute. So we've got workers from South Asia, especially in Nepal. And the example you gave was Malaysia. There was actually a case, and I published a case study about this specifically relating to the rubber glove industry during COVID. Okay, so for those that don't know, about 2/3, really more than 2/3 of the world's rubber gloves, especially the ones that are kind of high end, that are used for things like surgery, etc., they all originate out of Southeast Asia, and the vast majority of them actually come from Malaysia, increasingly Thailand, etc., but the majority from Malaysia. And so always, but especially during COVID, they brought in a lot of foreign nationals to work in their factories there. And again, we can imagine the juxtaposition during COVID of the massive increase in demand for PPE, if you remember that term, right? The personal protective equipment, right? For doctors, for nurses, for medical personnel. And so there was a spike in the need for these types of gloves. But simultaneously, the juxtaposition was you had these migrant camps or kind of factory living areas, oftentimes in either kind of shanty buildings or even sometimes in container shipping containers that have been converted into like living quarters. And they ended up not being up to the quality that a lot of people would typically perceive a multinational company to have. And in places like Malaysia, like Singapore, the majority of the initial COVID spikes were in those kind of migration or migrant living areas for these factories, because they were living in these very tight quarters and they didn't have proper medical supervision, et cetera. And so here you have two major forces that were kind of colliding. Where on the one hand, you've got the entire world, including developed Western countries, including National Health Service in the UK, et cetera, where they have the UK Modern Slavery Act, and they're not supposed to purchase goods and services that were made using forced labor, with a spike in demand for these various things. But then there was proven cases of what would be considered forced labor, bonded labor, et cetera. So again, just coming back to this, what do you see as priorities for companies going forward as they deal with these very competing demands of profit and growth and providing goods and services for their customers, many of whom are in wealthier, more developed nations, while simultaneously providing employment, often for people from the developing world, and making sure they at least provide conditions that are, worthy of the people that are working there. It just seems like it's ripe for conflict in many ways, right?
Well, let's talk about the COVID situation first. I mean, during that period of time, I think a lot of the West knew that the rubber gloves that were coming from Malaysia were tainted with modern slavery, exploitation, and so forth. But they were weighing whether or not if those rubber gloves weren't there, people might die. And as a result of that, countries become very introspective and selfish about, well, we're going to do it for ourselves. We'll worry about that later. And, then COVID ended, and there were some kind of repercussions associated with that and so forth. But I don't think anyone really made a big deal out of it, because at that particular time, they had to get those rubber gloves in and so forth. But, so I worked for the United Nations, and there was some talk of I'm not going to say the company, of a particular set of electronics that could be associated with modern slavery. And it just so happened that our project was using many of these products. Yeah. And so we had a conversation where we basically said, well, maybe we should be boycotting this. And what you saw from the people was just about anything but this, So people are fickle. There's this general sense of if you go in and you're looking at prawns and you know that responsibly sourced prawns versus ones that maybe, if you're going to have a big event and it's going to be the difference of $20 or $40 extra if you get them responsibly, the consumers often will say, okay, well, in this particular case, I want to save some money and so forth. That fickleness is what translates into companies not really feeling like if there's a scandal or if there's a big issue that comes up, they have to be too concerned about it, because people forget about it and move on to something else.
Which we've seen.
And you see it in social media all the time. There's a phenomena, it takes place, and a lot of the companies will just write it out, knowing that they need to do what they need to do. Now, if you're a large brand, and I think a lot of people don't understand this, you will do anything and everything to make sure that your supply chains are free of exploitation. It's too much of a business risk, a hassle. It infringes on the three major elements of private sectorness: profit, prestige, and growth. And for the most part, you have to make sure that those things aren't compromised. most people would say, well, a company would knowingly use slave labor for shareholder profits. It's just not the case. The difference that we see now, and this relates to ESG, is that if you have manufacturing from North America and Asia, for the most part, you're just looking at tier 1 factories. And you've been looking at that for 30 years. And those tier 1 factories are pretty well run and so forth. But you've never looked at tier 2, so tier 1 is where you assemble the running shoe, tier 2 is where the rivets and the shoelaces and the sole and everything else, tier 3 is the raw material. You've never looked down below that because nobody ever asked you to. Transparency legislation, this includes the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Act, the German, says that if you're a big company, you have to look all the way down to the lowest level of your supply chain. So let's say that you were doing 2,000 tier 1 audits. Now you got to put tier 2 in, maybe you're doing 10,000 audits.
Sure.
And companies are saying, well, who's going to pay for that? Is the running shoe going to go from $100 to $150? So you're seeing a kind of a consolidation of companies coming together. We're both using the same zipper company. We'll do zippers, you do shoelaces and so forth. That rationale is kind of taking place. But at the same time, they're struggling with the whole question of how do we look at our entire supply chain and know what's happening in order to be able to have some transparency in this. And I'll just tell you one other story. There was a very large cigarette company that, they sell cigarettes, and as a result of that, they didn't want the employment or forced labor issues to be a problem. So they hired a prominent organization, NGO, to look at their supply chain. They knew everything from the CEO to the tier 1 farms, but they didn't know tier second, third, and 4. And so they did a deep dive into it. And I happened to be at the briefing where they were talking about it. And they said, oh yeah, we found some children, we found some forced labor, but that's not what we want to talk about. What we want to talk about is we knew everything from CEO to tier 1, everything else below was a black hole. Now we know everything. And we found all kinds of quality issues. We found things that we could do in terms of getting better costs. We better understood our entire business. Why didn't we do this before? So when manufacture was taking place in North America, you didn't really have to pay much attention to this, and you kind of knew what was happening. But when you gave it over to Asia, you just said we just have to deal with one entity. Now, so that you knew that one entity, but there could be all kinds of risk associated with ESG and everything else down below that you didn't care about. With ESG, now the expectation is that you have to make sure you understand all these things. And if you don't, that vulnerability could be a serious naming and shaming scandal that happens if you don't address those types of things.